It seems like forever ago, but 2 years ago, Konami released a set called Duelist Saga, and in that set they reprinted a ton of cards from the past years of Yu-Gi-Oh!, mostly the iconic ones. One of the things that they did is that they reprinted cards with new effects in order to unban them in the TCG. I actually made a video about this titled Errata's Ruin Yu-Gi-Oh!, and since that video was made 2 years ago now, I've learned a lot. First off, I've learned that erratas isn't actually a word because errata is already plural, but also looking back at the video where I was just guessing how good or bad the new versions of those cards would be, now I can look back and actually definitively say, okay, did these effects actually make the cards playable but also balanced? Because realistically, in a perfect world, with these cards getting unbanned, what Konami should try to do is make them not broken but not terrible. You see, when Konami can unban a card by changing its effect, hopefully the card is balanced enough to still see play. I'm still mostly in favor of Konami just printing newer versions of cards. For example, instead of bringing back Pot of Greed and changing its effect, just print Pot of Desires or Pot of Extravagance. In today's video, I want to talk about the 7 cards that had their effects changed in Duelist Saga. Now, it's worth mentioning that of those 7 cards, 5 of them were banned before Duelist Saga, and then 2 of them just had their effects changed for one reason or another. Of these cards, especially the 5 that were unbanned, all of them are currently unlimited except for one of them, which I think in some ways can sort of give you a precursor to, yeah, these cards for the most part didn't stay as broken as they were when they were banned. The first card that I want to talk about is Rescue Cat, which is a longtime fan favorite. People love this card. It's adorable and it saw a ton of competitive play. Obviously enough competitive play to get it banned in the first place. When this card was banned, it was mainly banned because of its interactions with cards like Summoner Monk and X-Saber Emblem. It went from unlimited to limited, and then eventually it got forbidden, and that's probably for the best because at the time this card was limited, a lot of people in a lot of different decks were playing it. So the new effect of this card has 2 changes. Its effect reads, you can send this card to the graveyard to special summon 2 level 3 or lower beast-type monsters from your deck, but they have their effects negated, also they're destroyed during the end phase, and then it's also a hard once per turn. Now the 2 changes on the Rescue Cat effect that meant Konami could unban it and feel that it was safe is that it negates the effects of the monsters, and also it's a hard once per turn effect. Realistically, the hard once per turn thing doesn't matter too much. That wasn't really why this card was so powerful. Yes, it means you can't have Rescue Cat and Monster Reborn and summon 4 monsters. However, I don't think that's why this card was so good in the first place. Also, as far as the effect negation goes, while I do understand why this card needed that added onto, at least from Konami's perspective, in the 2 decks that this card ended up getting played in, that part didn't really matter that much. This card was played in Crusadias and Burning Abyss, in both cases to turbo out extra deck monsters, whether or not that was Xyz monsters or Link monsters, and in those cases you were mostly summoning cards that didn't have on-field effects in the first place. The BA deck, for example, summoned Danger monsters, they summoned Gallus, cards that don't have effects on the field, which leads me to believe that maybe Konami could have brought back Rescue Cat without these changes. Sure, there are cards that get the benefit from not having their effect negated. There certainly are some good level 3 or lower beast type monsters out there, but I don't know if this card would have made much more of an impact if it didn't have that restriction. Maybe the hard ones return is necessary for crazy firewall loops, at least when this card was brought back. Firewall Dragon was just coming out in a few months from here, but even then I'm not sure if there really was a recyclable way to use this card over and over again. Maybe once you add it back with Firewall Dragon and special it from your hand, but in general I don't know if that's what made this card so overpowered by 2019 standards. I think Konami just did this as a precautionary measure to make sure this card didn't see super competitive play, so even though this card doesn't really need those restrictions, arguably at least, it probably just needs them to be more in line with the current era of cards that Konami prints. When Future Fusion was banned, it was being used in many decks. The most prominent deck though was Chaos Dragons, because activating Future Fusion to reveal 5-headed dragon let you send 5 dragon monsters to the graveyard instantly. Of course, your opponent can always Mystical Space Typhoon the Future Fusion before you summon the 5-headed dragon, but what made this card so powerful is that it was basically a 5 monster Foolish Burial for any dragon strategy. This was way too overpowered, and the card was basically an instant win if you drew it going first, first with Chaos Dragons, and that's what mainly led it to being banned, but it also had a ton of loops because it's not a hard once return effect, and it still isn't even with the new Errata. But what makes this card so bad nowadays is that you don't get to send the monsters until your first standby phase after the card was activated. All it took for Konami to Errata Future Fusion was make sure that you couldn't send the monsters on the first turn you activate it, so now you have to wait until that first standby phase. But here's the deal, this card is virtually unplayable with that change, way more than Rescue Cat, because the only reason people really use Future Fusion was to put a bunch of monsters in the graveyard. The biggest problem with Future Fusion is that it was way too abusable. You could send dragons, you could send machines, you could send darks, you could use this card in so many different ways that Konami had to ban it. The problem is that even by changing one small thing in its text, just by making it one turn slower, the card goes from overpowered with no changes to basically unplayable with even that one change. Future Fusion hasn't seen play, it likely won't see play with this change, and it's kind of in a weird position. This is one of those cards out there that I wish Konami would have just kept banned instead of making it useless. And then you have a card like Imperial Order, which probably should have had more than one small change like Future Fusion. In the case of Imperial Order, the card still negates all spell effects that are on the field, and you still have to pay 700 life points during each standby phase or destroy the card. The only difference on the new version is that the payment is not optional. Now there's a few funny rulings with this, by the way, because this card actually won't kill you unless you have an exact multiple of 700 life points. If you have 600 life points or 800 life points, the card will just blow itself up, but if you can pay exactly 700, then you'll actually have to pay all of it and you'll just lose that game. However, even though this card is much worse because you can't just turn it off whenever you want to activate your own spells, this card is still very good. It sees play in almost every single stun-based deck or control-based strategy, and even saw some play in the combo decks for when you go first against decks like Sky Strikers. As long as spell cards are in the format, Imperial Order is going to be a fantastic trap card, and that's probably why it's the only one of these cards that got changed that's still limited. I think a lot of people would even argue, myself included, this card probably just shouldn't be in the game at all, even with this change. That'd be pretty crazy actually if Konami changed a card's effect, brought it off the ban list, and then had to re-ban it because it was still too strong. If there's any card that's going to happen to, it's probably going to be Imperial Order. Brionic Dragon of the Ice Barrier was once one of, if not the best level 6 synchro monsters in the entire game. It was good for setting up your own combos by looping your cards back to your hand, and it was also good for breaking your opponent's board, especially extra deck monsters. However, after the card got banned, Konami surely was scrambling to find ways to change this card's effect to bring it back in the game because it's such an iconic level 6 synchro. But in doing so, they changed its effects probably a little bit too much to make it see competitive play. It did see competitive play once, but first let's talk about the changes. The biggest two changes, or I guess the only two changes in this card's effect, is that it's a hard once per turn and can also only target your opponent's cards. Those changes are huge, by the way, probably the biggest of any of the cards that we're going to talk about, because this card was primarily used a lot of the times for looping your own cards and not all at once. What you could do with this card is something like activate a continuous spell card, bounce it back to your hand, do some more plays, play that continuous spell card, bounce it back to your hand again, over and over again, so on and so forth, and that was absolutely insane. So by making this card have a hard once per turn effect, you can still bounce multiple cards, but those cards have to be your opponent's cards and you have to do the discard all at once. That definitely makes this card a lot worse, and it basically didn't see any competitive play up until the most recent, or I guess 2 formats ago, Thunder Dragons. It wasn't the original pure Thunder Dragons, and it isn't the Seka's Light Thunder Dragons that we see nowadays. It was sort of like the middle ground. If you saw Jesse Cotton and a lot of those guys playing Thunder Dragons at YCS Sydney, they were using a crazy build with cards like Destrudo and Fairy Tale Snow. It was pretty wild. They even used Brilliant Fusion, and one of the cards that they summoned was Brionic because it was so good at breaking boards in the mirror match, even with its effects changed. However, outside of that one very specific event and that one very specific deck list, this card basically saw no play. Ever since Link Summoning happened, people have been really flocking to Mind Control. It's currently not super popular, but it has seen tons of play in the past couple months and even the past couple years ever since Lynx came out. However, Brain Control with the new text has basically never seen competitive play, never seen experimentation, despite the fact that Brain Control is supposed to be a better version of Mind Control and change of Heart is supposed to be a better version of Brain Control. Somehow, through one change that Konami made, they made Brain Control worse than its successor, Mind Control. Sure, Mind Control doesn't let you attack with the monster and doesn't let you tribute the monster, but Brain Control can now only be used on monsters that can be normal summoned or set. It's worth mentioning you don't have to use Brain Control on a non-special summon monster. You can still use it on a monster that was special summoned as long as it can be normal summoned or set. The problem here is that you can't steal extra deck monsters with Brain Control, and that's a pretty big deal, especially when you consider that Mind Control can steal extra deck monsters and is commonly played, or was commonly played, in a variety of going second strategies like Mech Knight Invoked. However, Brain Control on the other hand, with this one change, isn't looking so hot and basically no one has played it. It's a real shame because this card looks awesome. It has a really cool ultimate rare printing. The card would obviously be way better than Mind Control if it didn't have this change, so I can see why they made it if they wanted to bring the card back, but sadly this card probably won't see competitive play ever again. So now that we've covered the 5 cards that got unbanned with these new changes, let's talk about the 2 that were already unbanned in the TCG when these changes happened. So Goyo Guardian has a really interesting story because this card at the time of Duelist Saga and the TCG was already off the ban list and wasn't seeing play. However, whenever Duelist Saga or whatever the OCG equivalent was released, in the OCG format Goyo Guardian was still banned. Why this is funny is because in the TCG format we already weren't playing Goyo Guardian without any nerf, but it had to get nerfed to be in line with the OCG text. The big change here is that it's no longer a generic level 6 synchro monster, it requires an Earth Tuner instead. This makes the card even worse than it already was, which is funny because back in the day this card used to be a pretty powerful monster, one of the best level 6 synchros. It has a ton of attack power, it has an ability that can steal monsters that's absolutely ridiculous, especially back when it first came out. However, this card obviously has one huge problem, I mean multiple problems, but the biggest problem is this card can't steal Link monsters, which by the time Duelist Saga was coming out, Link monsters were just on the horizon. Even without the requirement to use an Earth Tuner, this card probably wouldn't be played in 2019, but especially with this new change, yeah, no one's gonna be playing Goyo Guardian anytime soon. And then we have Necrovalley. The 2 changes for the Duelist Saga version are as follows. The first change is that it negates any card effect that changes types or attributes in the graveyard. Once again, I have literally no idea why this was necessary. This doesn't actually help or hurt this card at all. What decks are playing cards that can change types or attributes in the graveyard? What a weird thing. Is this meant to only stop like the Elemental Lord deck? I have no idea. That effect really doesn't matter, but one thing that does matter is the other change that negates any card or effect that would move a card in the graveyard to a different place. Prior to this newest errata, that effect only stopped cards from moving other cards out of the graveyard. However, with this most recent text, you can't use cards like Machina Fortress that summon themselves without touching any other cards. That's actually a huge change when you look at modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it means cards like Salamangreat Spinny can't revive themselves under Necrovalley, where if it was the old text, you actually could summon those things because they weren't touching any other cards. Anyway though, that's gonna wrap up today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. What do you think about Konami changing text on older cards? Is it okay if they get unbanned but they're basically unplayable competitively? Is that okay, or should they just keep them banned? Let me know in the comment section below. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.